Hi, I'm Nick with Calibrated Power. On this episode of Diesel Insights, we dive deep. So put your scuba gear on because we're going all the way to the bottom of the sea of 351-300VG turbo performance. We put a 6.7 liter Cummins on the dyno, standalone harness, and ran it against stock turbo, our STR, and our Stealth 64 at a slew of horsepower and RPM points. And we're going to talk about how that test went, what the limitations are of each turbocharger, where each turbo shines over the other, and just kind of really understand what the limitations are on the 6.7 liter engine. Okay, so jumping into our data set here, the first thing I want to show you is the stock turbocharger. So the question I get from customers is, how much power can you make on a stock turbo? Okay, let me answer that for you. 544 horsepower. You can make that at 2,750 RPM. Would I recommend it? No, I wouldn't. That 544 horsepower on our engine dyno shows up as about 495 horsepower on a dyno jet and about 460 horsepower on a Mustang dyno. So just for comparison's sake, right? At that number, let me show you what happens to the truck. Okay, so full left-hand side here is our stock turbo. Stock turbo, these first two graphs, horsepower actual and torque actual, are just showing you that yes, we made the horsepower number and at that RPM. So moving down, first thing I want to draw your attention to is EGT. So at 450, let's just look at the factory stuff. Okay, so factory truck rated for 400 horsepower, the HO, right? And let's look at EGT at 400 horsepower. 1341 to 2250, 1321, 1337, 1381. You seen a theme here? Just shy of 1400 degrees. 1350 to 1400 degrees, the factory calls that pretty good, and the truck sustains that pretty well. As we jump up to 450, we add 50 horsepower tune. We pick up about 100 degrees exhaust gas temperature, maybe a little bit more. We add more power. We go up to 500 horsepower, and we're at 1630 degrees exhaust gas temp, and then 1800 at the shift point. Whew, that's hot. And we push this thing all the way into the red, that 544 horsepower, 500 rear wheel, 460 Mustang dyno. You're looking at close to 1800 degrees, so 1750 to 1800 degrees. Keep in mind when you're looking at any cell in this histogram that the engine was held there for a period of time. This wasn't like a run through a dyno pull at 7 seconds or 8 seconds and look back at the log and see what the EGT was. The engine was throttled to that point and held there for probably 5 to 10 seconds, sometimes even longer. So the EGT data, first thing, it's yellow data. We don't hold the engine at the same spot for the same amount of time every single time. We're just not that good at it. We do our best, we try and make it consistent, but just understand there is a little bit of inconsistency from cell to cell. You can kind of get the picture of that looking at the data. The second thing is that's a sustained number. So that's if you were to run the truck on the road towing. We call this kind of our towing test. So these histograms show what towing performance would look like at that power level. Would I recommend you hold an engine at 1800 degrees exhaust gas temperature for any length of time? I would not recommend that, but it's my engine. I can do what I want. Okay, let's talk about Lambda. So why do I bring Lambda up? Well, for one, I think the diesel industry needs to know more about Lambda. Lambda is air-fuel ratio. Stoichiometric on a diesel is about 14.5 to 1. The reason we don't run stoichiometric is because diesel doesn't mix perfectly with air in combustion. Remember, the injector is turning on during the power stroke, and because of that, the fuel charge is basically chasing the piston down the bore as it's burning. Ideally, like in a direct inject gas engine, we inject the fuel at the bottom of top dead center and we ignite it with a spark plug, and we get great homogeneous combustion throughout the combustion chamber, and we use every little bit of oxygen we have in the combustion chamber. On this 6.7 liter Cummins, we simply can't do that. So we need more air than stoichiometric or more air than Lambda in order to get great combustion. When I say more air, what do I mean? Well, 1.0 is stoichiometric. So when you look at Lambda, you see 1.0, that means 14.5 to 1. If you see 1.15, that is about where the engine stops running clean. So if you go lower than 1.15, the engine starts to run dirty. That means that we simply don't have a good enough mixture of the oxygen that's in the chamber to burn the fuel fully, and therefore we get a little bit of black smoke and some particle matter. That particle matter turns into DPF soot and will clog the DPF sooner. So emissions equipped trucks, we try and keep them at the 1.15 limit, maybe a little bit lower than that, but I would definitely not go below 1.10 on an emissions equipped truck. Okay, so 500 horsepower, we see we got 1.16, 1.12 lambda. That's pretty close to a limit on an emissions equipped truck. I would leave that alone. You see at 550 horsepower, to make the big number, we need 1.06, 1.04 lambda. I'll tell you, that is smoky. That's not something you want to run on an emissions equipped truck. When you see smoke like that, you know EGTs are high, you know the emission system isn't happy about it, you know the turbine's hot, the pistons are hot, the manifold's hot, everything is hating its life at that point. So when I look at lambda, it's a great indicator of engine happiness. And I'm looking for 1.15. Okay. Mass airflow, next thing here, 444 grams. I like to equate mass airflow grams per second to like clean airflow horsepower. So if I have 500 grams per second, I know I can make 500 clean horsepower. This is not a perfect math thing, but just something I keep in mind. The other thing that I'll tell you is that the mass airflow sensor on a 13 to 18 Cummins is not capable of reading accurately above 460 to 480 grams per second. The data is just not clean up there. So this data, I would say below yellow. You're looking at orange data, especially below 400 grams per second. Fuel injection quantity. Why do we measure fuel injection quantity? Well, it's a great way to compare. So if I need, let's say at 2,500 RPM to make 400 horsepower, I need 132 mm3 or cubed microliters of fuel in order to make that power per stroke. I can compare that to how much fuel I need with another turbocharger, and that gives me a great indicator of efficiency. So let's say Turbo A needs 100 and Turbo B needs 110. Well, I know Turbo B is 10% less efficient than Turbo A at that horsepower and RPM. So that's why I measure fuel rate. Factory fuel control, you're looking at somewhere in the 115 to 130 range. Efficiency, that's just our way of putting those numbers into a way to convert fuel rate into an engine efficiency. So diesel engine efficiency, typically between 40 and 60% depending on engine size and designed engine rate, like RPM, operating rate. So like an over-the-road tractor would have a much narrower operating window. Therefore, efficiency would be better at those lower RPMs in that narrow window. The 6.7 liter Cummins has a relatively wide operating window compared to an over-the-road truck. So our peak engine efficiency is going to be a little lower, but we are going to have a wider window to operate in. Boost pressure. I don't need to explain this to you guys. You made it through, whatever, a few minutes of this video already. If you don't know what boost pressure is, click on the next link. 38 PSI peak on the stock turbocharger. You're going to see the factory map sensor maxes out around 37 PSI. So you probably won't know if your turbo makes more than 37 PSI unless you put like a 10 bar map sensor or you put an aftermarket gauge in the truck. Boost, you know, there's a lot of hating on boost out there. What I'll tell you is that if you control your inlet air temps and you have a good intercooler and do relatively consistent runs on the truck, the boost pressure is a pretty good proxy for airflow. If there's boost, there's airflow. Drive pressure, love this one. Well, this makes me almost as excited as lambda. So drive pressure is how much pressure is in the turbine housing. So how efficient is the turbine at converting the energy in the exhaust into boost pressure? We'd love to see 1.1 numbers or 1-to-1 numbers, so the same drive pressure to get the same boost. So 37 pounds of drive pressure to 37 pounds of boost, right? But you can tell that's not the case. So here, to make 38 pounds of boost at 2750, we need 60 pounds of drive pressure. That gives us a drive pressure ratio. Drive pressure ratios are great for seeing when the engine's happy or unhappy. On the 6.7 Cummins, I can tell you it starts to get pretty unhappy around the 1.25 to 1 ratio. If you're running more than 1.25 to 1 drive to boost, you are spending a lot of horsepower to make your power. So you're working that engine very hard. A lot of the fuel you're using is being converted to heat and drive pressure in order to get that turbocharger to work right, and if efficiency is going down, and basically it's not an ideal situation. You can see on the factory turbo, when we go above 400 horsepower, 450, we get 1.22, 1.38, 1.43. You can see we're approaching and then cresting 1.5 drive to boost numbers. So, you know, the factory turbine is a notoriously small setup on the 6.7 liter, and it's one of the hardest things to modify as a turbo builder. So controlling it, and not controlling it, but basically getting it to perform at those high levels is difficult. There's a lot of design constraints in that turbocharger, and working around those design constraints can be trouble as far as turbo builders go. I'd like to say we're at the top of our game here, and I'll show you why in a bit, but I understand that's a difficult spot to work in. Turbo speed. Love to talk about turbo speed because it's a good way to fail a turbocharger. The factory limits turbo speed to around 135,000 shaft RPM. It does that to not degrade parts. So we got bearings, we got a lot of parts in there that we want to stay alive for hundreds of thousands of miles. And when you spin things at really high speeds, they tend to deform or lose their oil film or otherwise fail. Now the factory turbo has a cast compressor wheel, which isn't as resilient shaft speed wise as our billet compressor wheels. So we still respect the 135,000 shaft speed-ish with our billet compressor wheels, which is in the STR and the 64. I like to bring up shaft speed because there's builders out there who do not respect shaft speed, and that's fine. Everybody can do their own thing, but just understand that if you don't respect shaft speed, you are putting yourself at risk for turbo failure, and that's certainly a possible thing. I've seen turbos destroyed from being oversped. It's not pretty, and you don't want that to happen to you. So, you know, keeping that constraint of about 135 to 140,000 shaft speed will probably keep us safe. I have not seen a turbo explode in this application at 145,000 shaft speed, 150,000 shaft speed. But that said, I'd like to keep them at 135. VGT actual position, this is for the tuners. So what vane position were you running when you got that data? There it is, it's shared with you. Lower numbers mean the nozzle ring is further open. Higher numbers mean the nozzle ring is further closed. Remember, this is steady state data. So the engine has had time to spool up. This is not a spool up test. So this is basically steady state, what vane position is needed to achieve that boost. And fuel pressure, that's just for my own edification, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, so we had limitations on the factory turbocharger. We talked about that, 544 horsepower. We saw the high EGT, we saw the high lambda. What we didn't see was high shaft speed. We couldn't get to shaft speed to crest 135,000 RPM, and I would say the reason we couldn't get that to happen was because we did not close the vanes any tighter. If we closed the vanes tighter, which a lot of tuners do, if we went to 20% or 30% or 40% vane position, our shaft speed would have gone up dramatically. And we did this in a separate test. I don't have that data in front of me here, but I'll tell you, you can get over 150,000 RPM very quickly by going to 40% vane position or 35% vane position. And I know there's guys out there that go higher than that even at full load. Doing that will move more air. It will lower EGTs. It will make about the same power, and it'll make a lot of drive pressure. I don't see that as a good value trade-off wise. Guys looking at some of their gauges might think like, oh, this is a much better tune, or I'm moving a lot more air, or boost is much higher. If you're not measuring it on the dyno, you don't know, okay? And we measured on the dyno, and I think that the vane positions that you're seeing here, steady state-wise, are the vane positions that should be used for a reason. That's because they use the least amount of fuel to make that power at set RPM. So the limitation on the factory turbocharger is lambda, and that turns into EGT. So we add our STR to the mix. Okay, so basically we just bolt our STR on this thing. All of a sudden, 582 horsepower. Okay, that's awesome. So we picked up about 35 horsepower. When we did that, we also noticed that our EGT, so at 550 horsepower, our EGT went way down. From 1800 degrees to 1592. So is 1592 cool? No, it's not cool, but it's not crazy hot, especially compared to what the factory was running there. I'll show you the comparison here. So EGT wise, so we're down, 250 degrees, 168 degrees, 217 degrees, 306. So this major EGT drop under heavy load. And when I say under heavy load, I mean above 2,000 RPM and above 350 horsepower. Below that, EGT did go up a little bit. Adding turbochargers that are slightly larger than stock is a compromise. You will see a little bit of EGT creep below 2,000 RPM. That's okay, we have room to go, so it's a compromise that I'm okay making, but you should be aware of it. Lambda. So our lambda at 550 horsepower cleaned up big time. going from 1.06 to 1.21. Remember, 1.15 is kind of that safety number. We were even able to go up to 600 horsepower, but we couldn't get there with the factory CP3 pump. So we had to add a 10 millimeter pump to get over 600 horsepower. Ultimately, we were able to achieve 615 horsepower with the STR. When we did that, we saw that EGT at 615 horse was 1630. We got it to crest 1720 EGT, but that was at 3000 RPM. We had to use a long pulse width on the injector to get that power number, and when you use a long pulse width on the stock injector, you end up introducing a lot of heat and lowering lambda, especially at high RPM, because that pulse width is so wide and the piston speed is so high that you simply end up chasing the piston down the bore. That's why I don't recommend using super high shift points on stock turbos, stock injector trucks, and I'll show you in a minute what happens when you add fuel pressure to this mix, which then cools off EGTs as well. Okay, so let's stick to the STR though. What else did we see with the STR? The STR moved more airflow. So mass airflow wise, you can see anything over 350 horsepower and 2000 RPM, mass airflow started to pick up. 30 more grams per second, 20 more grams per second, the ability to run at 600 horsepower. Main injection fuel quantity. So I want to draw your attention to this over 350 horsepower and over 2000 RPM area, where we start to see 5 less MM3, 7 less MM3, 13 less, 16 less, 20 less MM3 at 550 horsepower to make the power number. That's 10% less fuel to make the same power number. Where do you think that 10% worth of fuel was going? Directly into exhaust pressure and EGT. So when you're able to run the turbo with more airflow and a more efficient exhaust side, you're able to use less fuel, and that translates right here into this table where you see this green pad. Boost pressure on an STR. Factory, we talked about maxing out about 38 psi. The STR goes up to 42, 43 psi. So we add about 5 psi of boost pressure. Great, nice. Drive pressure, on the other hand, comes down. So at 550 horsepower, at 2500 RPM, we're down 10 psi of drive pressure. At 2750, we're down 15 psi. If the stock turbo would have went higher, we would have seen bigger differences. But to add 5 psi of boost and drop 15 psi of drive, that makes a huge dent in the drive to boost ratio. So we take a drive to boost ratio, let's say on the stock turbo at 550 horse of 1.6, and then all of a sudden we're down at 1.08 on the STR. That's pretty awesome. I was expecting good results with the STR because I know how much effort we put in the turbine side, but I honestly was surprised by how nice that number was. I was really impressed with that. Turbo speed. So I want to draw your attention first below that to VGT actual position, and you can see we use about the same VGT actual positions down here in the high horsepower range. On the shaft speed, remember we talked about 135,000 shaft speed. So the reason that we stopped at the power level we did on the STR was because we were cresting that 135,000. So we saw as high as 145,000 at 3000 RPM and 600 horsepower. At 2750 and 600 horsepower, we saw 137,000 shaft speed. I'm okay with these numbers. We advertise the turbo to be able to perform at this level. I haven't seen an overspeed on an STR yet, so I'm okay with these numbers. What I will tell you is I don't want to push the turbo any harder than this. It's not limited by lambda, it's not limited by EGT, it's limited by shaft speed basically. So that's the limit on the STR. If you want to make more than 600 horsepower or more than 100 horsepower over stock, I would say the STR is great up to that point. If you want to go past that, then we need a little bit bigger turbocharger. The next turbocharger I want to talk about is the 64. Okay, so the 64 is, like its namesake, slightly larger than the STR. So let's see what happens when we go to a 64 instead of the STR. Well, we bolt the 64 on, and immediately we get zero change in horsepower. In fact, we get stuck at 615 horsepower, basically exactly the same spot we were. So what we needed to do was add more fuel. We basically were out of fuel, and the way that we added more fuel wasn't by adding bigger injectors, but it was by adding fuel pressure. So we jumped the fuel pressure up from 29,000 psi up to 34,000 psi to get the extra fuel that we needed. Now doing this allowed us to shorten the pulse width up at those higher power levels. And anytime you can shorten the pulse width up, you can effectively lower exhaust gas temperature and improve lambda. Remember, higher injection pressures give us better atomization, better mixture, and shorter injection windows. Doing those things improves the mixture, improves lambda, and improves exhaust gas temps. So once we raised fuel pressure, all of a sudden we were able to get 700 horsepower on the dyno. So we went from 615 up to 700 horsepower. An addition of 85 horsepower simply by adding that fuel pressure sensor that worked up to 35,000 psi and calling for 34,000 psi and changing the tune slightly to get there. Let's talk about EGT. So we're talking about the 550 number, and if you compare, like let's just say 2750 for instance, the STR made 1592, the 64 makes 1460. So almost 100 degree, actually more than 100 degree drop in exhaust gas temperature. Now that's a combined drop, not just the efficiency of the 64 mil turbo, but also what we just talked about with the higher fuel pressure. So remember that when you see those 500 plus horsepower numbers, that those are high fuel pressure numbers as well. So not only is the turbocharger better, but it's a combination of the turbo and the better fuel injection setup. Here's the delta, 100 degrees difference, 200 degrees difference, 130 degrees difference. If you average these, it's about 150 degree drop in exhaust gas temperature above 500 horsepower. If you don't need that 600 horsepower or 100 horsepower over stock, if you just want to go, below 600 and not above it, then I wouldn't recommend the 64. The 64 is going to give up a little bit more than the STR down low. A little bit slower coming to life, not much, but a little bit slower, right? So it's a matter of picking the least amount of turbo that you need to make your horsepower goal. Let's talk about lambda. Okay, so at 550 horsepower, we're able to get a delta of about 0.1 lambda, so that's significant. That's 10% cleaner burn. That's a combination of that injection, remember, and the turbocharger. 600 horsepower over 0.1, and we're still at 1.11 lambda at 700 horsepower. So we're not even, this isn't like sled pull territory. This isn't super smoky. Yeah, it's got a little haze out of the pipe. Yeah, I wouldn't put it on a emissions equipped truck at this power level, but it's not awful. You can see the improvement in the delta for the fuel quantity. So negative 0.86, negative 13.8, negative 30 on MM3 as far as usage at that 550 horsepower level. It just shows you the more efficient use of the 64 mil. Boost pressure, 44 psi up from 43 psi. So not a major bump in boost pressure. Drive pressure, still not wildly different. I mean, really what the 64 does is just kind of slow things down a little bit. So the biggest change in the 64 is its ability to support more horsepower at lower shaft speed and be safe. If I could sum it up in one sentence, that would be it. So let me show you the shaft speed. At 600 horsepower, the 64 is at 123,000 RPM, whereas the STR is at 137,000 RPM. So we really don't even crest 130,000 RPM at 700 horsepower, even at 2,750 RPM. It's pretty awesome. I mean, we really have a safe setup at that power level as far as long-term reliability on the 64 mil charger at 700 horsepower. Again, that's at 0% vane position, so same vane positions we ran on the STR. It's really an apples to apples comparison. And then you can see at 600 plus horsepower we added fuel pressure, so that's when you get those deltas. Really the takeaway here is if you need 100 horsepower or less more than stock, or you want to run stock power but you want it to be efficient, more efficient than stock above 350 horsepower and 2,000 RPM, the STR is a great replacement turbocharger. It's basically going to perform like stock at low RPM and low outputs, support better performance than stock above 2,000 RPM and 350 horsepower, and give you an operating ceiling of 600 horsepower, or about 100 horsepower higher than the stock turbocharger, apples to apples, lambda to lambda. If you want to run higher than that, so more power than that, then consider the 64. The 64 will give you another 80 horsepower, 85 horsepower over the STR, and it'll do so safely, so at a shaft speed below 135,000 RPM. All these turbochargers are going to allow you to maintain the factory exhaust brake. They're all going to work without any major tuning changes, so no fancy vane position tables. In fact, they all passed emissions testing, USO 6 and FTP 75 reasonable basis testing on a stock truck. So you could put any of these turbochargers on a stock truck. It'll run fine, it'll pass emissions, everything's happy. These turbos will work on a 07 up to 18, and then we have a separate turbocharger RPO, but basically the same rotating assemblies from 19 to 24. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. Come up for air, decompress, get yourself a beverage, you earned it. I will see you on the next one. I'm Nick Priegnitz, thanks for watching.